Okay, hopefully you have your notes again. This is something that I just wanted to go over kind of briefly, and it has to do with something called a fontanelle. You see on this fetal skull, you have an anterior fontanelle right here. I'll get my little pen out. Let's see, I'll make it red. Anterior fontanelle here. And there is a posterior fontanelle on the back. And then you have a lateral one, there's a mastoid here, and a sphenoidal one here. So there are 4 fontanelles. The word fontanelle means little fountain. And basically they named it those because of right here on the baby's skull. When you have a newborn, you can see a little pulse right here in the anterior fontanelle, this anterior one. And fontanelle means little fountain. It's like an aquifer, and you can see water bubbling up out of that. So these are the soft spots. This is where the bones haven't quite ossified yet between these cranial bones, and so they're still soft. So those are called fontanelles. Something else I want you to look at is the bones that form the orbit of the eye, and I've got them listed right here. I may ask you something about that, and you can see them right here. They're all talked about on this slide here. So look over and you can see that the frontal bone forms the top of the orbit, the zygomatic, the lateral portion, the maxillary, kind of the bottom, and some of the medial portion, the ethmoid bone on the inside, this little brown one here, and the green one, the lacrimal bone, and then the one that goes all the way through across the back, the sphenoid, this pink one. So you can kind of look at that. Now on page 2 of your notes, you have the mandible. Here's the mandible, your jaw. And there are some parts here. They're pretty easy on the mandible. The horizontal portion is called the body. The bend, the angle of your jaw is called the angle. You can just call it angle. The upright portions, this one and the one on the other side, the uprights, each one's called a ramus. So each one of these is a ramus, the upright portions. There is an articulating surface here that articulates with your temporal bone. This is called the mandibular condyle. You've heard of TMJ problems. Temporal mandibular joint is the joint between this mandibular condyle and the mandibular fossa on the temporal bone. We have a projection here called the coronoid process. And between the coronoid process and the mandibular condyle is the mandibular notch. In the front, here's the mental foramen. We saw that, the foramen on the front of the face. There's your mental foramen. And then the teeth are set in bone called alveolar margin. It's the alveolar bone, but that's the alveolar margin there. There is a bone in your neck. You can feel it right up underneath your mandible. It's a little bone called the hyoid bone. It means U-shaped. It's the hyoid bone. So that one is called the hyoid bone. Now the vertebrae. You have a vertebral column, and it says there are 5 groups of vertebrae which make up the vertebral column, and there are. You see that they're grouped here. The cervical, this is in your neck. There's 7 cervical vertebrae, and they're labeled C1 to C7. And so when you have someone that broke a vertebrae in their neck, they'll tell you which one they broke. You know, they'll label it C1 through 7. The kind of purple shaded area here, this is your thoracic vertebrae, and there's 12 of those, T1 through T12. So they're numbered from the top one all the way down to T12. There are 5 lumbar vertebrae, and they're the blue kind of here, L1 through L5, so there's 5 lumbar. And then there's about 5 fused sacral. You can see there's a fusion line there, a little light little line. So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, roughly 5 that are fused together to form this solid structure called the sacrum. And then there's about 4 fused vertebrae that form the tail end called the coccyx. So be familiar with the numbers of vertebrae. 7 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 fused that make up the sacrum, and around 4 fused that make up the coccyx. You can see that there are curves here. When you're an infant, your vertebral column is straight. When you raise your head, you get this cervical curvature here in your neck. That's what it's called. And when you stand, you get this lumbar curve. Lumbar curve. All your organs are trying to pull forward, and it pulls the lumbar vertebrae forward. Okay, cervical. Well, here's your thoracic curvature here, and then your lumbar. So it goes out, in, out. Cervical, thoracic, lumbar. So know the numbers. Some terms. Scoliosis, abnormal lateral deviation of the spine. So it goes left and right. And I have a picture in just a minute. Kyphosis, an exaggerated thoracic curvature, like a where their shoulders are leaned over and their head is down. It's like a buffalo hump. And then lordosis, exaggerated lumbar curvature, where your butt sticks out. They call it a teacup booty, where it sticks out. So let's look at these pictures. Here's scoliosis, even though that's covered, the S is covered here. You see it's a lateral curvature of the spine. Goes left and right. Kyphosis, here's a hump in the back. So you see there's like a buffalo hump. Your thoracic vertebrae are bent over, so you're kind of leaning over. And then lordosis of an exaggerated lumbar curve. Makes your buns stick out. Got a little teacup booty, what they call it. So those are some abnormal curvatures. Might want to remember those. Let's look at the rib cage here. And we're going to get down the real names of these ribs. There are 24 ribs, and we're not going to call them true and false. We're going to get some new names for these. Okay, the first 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7, they attach, they go from the vertebral column and attach to the sternum. This bone right here is the sternum, we're going to look at in just a minute, with their own piece of cartilage. Number 1 does, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and number 7 has its own piece of cartilage. Those are called your vertebrosternal ribs. So when you look on page 3, when you look at the top right under ribs, there's vertebrosternal, the first 7 pair. So you've been calling those true ribs, but their actual name is the vertebrosternal. They go from the vertebrae and attach to the sternum, this breastbone here, the sternum, with their own piece of cartilage. The next 3, 1, 2, and 3, share a piece of cartilage, and they hitch a ride with number 7 of the vertebrosternal. So they go from the vertebrae and attach by way of a piece of cartilage, shared cartilage, to the sternum. So they are called vertebrochondral ribs. Those 3 are the vertebrochondral. 8, 9, and 10 are vertebrochondral ribs. And the last 2 go from the vertebrae and they float. That's why they call them the floating. They're called vertebral ribs. They go from the vertebrae and float. So they're called vertebral. So you have 2 pair of vertebral ribs. Those are the ones that protect like your kidneys. We're going to look at these 3 together here called the sternum. And you can see it's made up of 3 bones. The manubrium is the top bone. The main portion here is the body. And the little dagger down here is called the xiphoid process. Xiphoid implies like a knife blade. So 3 parts, manubrium, body, and xiphoid process make up the sternum. And so we have a real one on this next slide. And here it is. Here they are, the manubrium, the body, and here's the xiphoid process. The xiphoid process, when you're young, is pretty much hyaline cartilage, and as you age, it ossifies due to the hormones. We're going to look at the basic anatomy of a vertebra. Almost all of them have this same anatomy shape. Okay? Almost all of them have the same anatomy shape. So when you look at them, they have about the same parts. So you look at the general features of vertebrae, they have pretty much the same things. They have a main load-bearing portion called the body. Coming up from the body are 2 little columns called pedicels. It means column. It actually means little feet, but it's a column. So you have a main load-bearing portion, the body, 2 extensions, 2 little column-like supports called pedicels. And then there's a roof here. It's like a roof. The overhangs that go out to the side are called the transverse processes. Transverse process. They form a roof. These are called the lamina. The roof is the lamina, and where the lamina fuse together, they form a spine or a spinous process. Now, by doing that, there's a hole in the middle called the vertebral foramen that the spinal cord can go through. So most of them, not all of them, most of them have the same body plan. A body, 2 supporting columns called pedicels, and a roof-like structure on top. The overhangs of the roof, they go out to the side, transverse processes. The roof portion that they form, these are called the lamina, and the lamina fuse together to form the spinous process. Sometimes when someone breaks their back, they'll break this, and they'll do what's called a laminectomy. They'll come in and take this part, either this part off with half the spine, or they'll take the whole spine with the lamina to remove it, because it could have little bone fragments could hurt the spinal cord here in the middle. This is just showing a rib, and let's just not worry too much about the rib right now. But it has like a head, a neck, and an angle and a body. But this just shows you how the ribs articulate with the vertebrae. So they do attach to the vertebrae, and they do articulate, and they come all around to the front. See, here's the back, and it comes all the way around to the front to attach to the sternum. So I probably will bypass a rib anatomy, but I might ask you the 3 different types of ribs for sure. How many there are their names. And this is just a close-up showing how the rib does articulate with the vertebrae. 3 types of vertebrae. Okay, there are cervical, thoracic, and lumbar. There are 3 types. Now, I don't see how they have them labeled here, but they are. These are cervical here on the far left. These are thoracic in the middle, and these are lumbar on the side. If you look at the cervical, here is one characteristic common to all cervicals, and we're going to look at them first. They do have a body. They have the pedicels. They have a transverse process, which is kind of blunt, the lamina, and they do have a spinous process on most of them. Your first 2 are modified. That's what I'll say. I keep saying the most. C1 and C2 are a little bit different. But all your cervical vertebrae have, in the pedicel, they have a transverse foramen. They all have that. You see, you don't see that on the thoracics or the lumbars. It's only in the cervicals. And an artery called the vertebral artery goes through those transverse processes up to your brain. So they go the same direction as your carotid arteries do, but these are going up through your neck, through these transverse foramen. Now, something else about them, you'll see the characteristics on page 3, cervical vertebrae. They have a bifid spine. Bifid means two heads, and see it forms like a slingshot. Now that you can find that on a lot of them, but they don't all have that. But that's one of the characteristics. The dead giveaway are the transverse foramen. All of them have that. And they're the only ones that have the transverse foramen. So let's look at some cervicals. Here's the first cervical vertebrae, and it's called the atlas. One thing you can notice right off the bat, it doesn't have a body and it doesn't have a spine. It has a posterior tubercle on the back, but it's not called a spine. So it doesn't have a body and it doesn't really have a spinous process, but it does have transverse foramen. So this one is different than all the rest of them. Is C1, called the atlas. It's called the atlas because in Greek mythology, Atlas holds the world on his shoulders. Well, this one is holding the skull on top of your body, on top of the vertebral column. It's the very top vertebra holding your skull. So they named it after Atlas. A real one, let's look at the characteristics we saw. There's a good bifid spine there. That's a characteristic of cervicals. And there's your transverse foramen. Definitely a good characteristic to remember for cervical vertebrae. Here's C2, which is called the axis. It's called the axis because it has this tooth-like structure coming up that the atlas rotates around. And I've got a picture in just a minute that'll show you that, because the atlas sits on top of here, and by the atlas holding your head, when you do yes and no movements, it pivots around this post here called the dens. Dens means tooth. It's called the dens or the odontoid process. Remember, orthodontists are people who put braces on you. They're teeth. So that word means tooth. But you see it also has transverse foramen. And there's a little bitty bifid spine there. This is showing you how the atlas sits on top of the axis, but I have a better picture. There it is. There's the atlas, sits on top of the axis, and there's the dens there with a little ligament going across it that allows you to turn your head left and right. That's this movement here with the arrow. When people break their necks, this oftentimes is broken off and it severs the spinal cord. And that's what kills you. Severs the spinal cord. So all of your cervical vertebrae have several characteristics that are common to them, but the main one, to never get a vertebrae wrong, to always know which one you're looking at, which of the three types. Cervical are the only ones that have those transverse foramen. They're the only ones that are going to have these transverse foramen. Thoracic. Well, thoracics have long, slender, downward sloping spines. They don't have transverse foramen. And one of the keys about those, which again you can't see, so I'm just showing you, I won't ask you this on a test, not on thoracics. They have flat superior and inferior articulating surfaces. They sit on top of each other. They're flat. And they have long spines. So you would know the difference between a cervical and a thoracic. Cervical have transverse foramen, thoracics don't. There are 7 cervical, there are 12 thoracic. This is thoracic sitting on top of each other. Again, long spines. Lumbar. Those flat surfaces have been rolled medial and lateral, so they're side by side now instead of sitting on top of each other, and they have blunt spines. So if you had them to look at in lab, you would be able to tell them apart by these surfaces on top and bottom. These are side by side, whereas thoracics are on top of each other. I won't ask you that either. Just know the number of lumbars, okay? A big close-up of your lumbars. Here's your sacrum. Remember, it was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 fused vertebrae, and there's your transverse fusion lines there. It holds them together, and it makes this structure that we call the sacrum. Okay, and I have one slide that shows how this is going to fit, because and there's your coccyx down here. Remember, 1, 2, 3, 4 fused. On the back side, the spines are fused together, and it forms a median sacral crest. There's a hole here, the sacral canal. So your spinal cord is going to go through this hole down underneath this spine, and it exits through the sacral hiatus. This is the end of the spinal cord that's going to exit here. Okay. This is the front side, the anterior surface of your sacrum. Here's the posterior surface, and the spines are fusing. All the spines are on the side, so you know that that's the back side. So you can see what they look like. When it's put together with the coxal bones, you see it just right in the middle here. And here are your coxal bones that come across around the middle. The pubis bones are in the front, and there's your pubic symphysis. Your legs plug into the acetabulums on the side. Here's the upper rim of your ilium, your iliac bone, and your sacrum fits right in the middle. It's on the back side. And that's the end of this slide set. I had to shorten slide set number 9. It has repetitive stuff we've already looked at, and I just picked out the new stuff.